Biodiversity with bite. How bringing back top predators can restore life to entire ecosystem. And the immigrants who destroy the environment when messing with nature goes horribly wrong. I'm Martin Stanford. This is Insight. Hello, welcome to Insight. Wolves and beavers may not seem to have much in common, but between them, they could help save the environment, or at least parts of it. It's all down to what's called rewilding, the introduction of species that had previously been removed from an ecosystem, and the sometimes surprising effect scientists say it can have on a habitat. Insight senior correspondent Dana Lewis explains.
Wildlife experts say something incredible is happening along Britain's River Otter. After 500 years, beavers which were hunted and chased away from these riverbanks of red clay have returned.
So these are some very obvious beaver signs. They've probably spent 3 or 4 nights taking down this tree, and they'll usually cut it towards the water because what they want to do is be in the safety of water.
Industrious, powerful, beavers are called a keystone species. Reintroduced in the UK, they do more than build dams and bring down trees. They, in essence, create a cascade of life on the river. By creating pools of water, they're also making a breeding ground for fish and insects and even songbirds.
The dragonfly larvae, the mayflies that all breed and use that standing water as a place to be. All those things in turn are feeding birds that we see around us in the trees here, and so on. So you get this cascade, if you like, of wildlife all coming out of a landscape that has partly been created by these beavers.
And believe it or not, beavers do amazing things to water. First, their dams and canals slow down water flows, and that helps curb flooding in the UK, which has been getting worse each year, in part because of global warming. And there is evidence water which flows off farmers' fields full of nitrates from fertilizers is actually purified in beaver ponds, something companies usually spend millions of dollars to do, but can simply be accomplished by allowing nature to take its normal course and by allowing beavers to come back to their natural habitats. This just isn't about the reintroduction of the beaver, but the reestablishment of an entire ecosystem. And it's been done across Europe at 150 locations in 24 countries with what wildlife experts say are very positive results. And in general, they say when you bring back a species that has been lost, there is a cascade which actually changes natural landscapes. After a 70-year absence, wolves were reintroduced to America's Yellowstone National Park in 1995. The stunning results of what is called a trophic cascade, documented by wildlife organizations.
We all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others.
The Yellowstone wolves killed some deer and elk, but also chased many into other areas of the park. So overgrazed land regenerated, trees sprouted, and drew more beavers.
They create niches for other species, and the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians.
And the wolves are credited with even changing the course of rivers in Yellowstone, where revegetation stabilized riverbanks. Could wolves be reintroduced in Europe? Well, it's already being discussed.
As regards what you need for a wolf pack, obviously it depends on the richness of the habitat and the biodiversity that it can support. You'll be looking at somewhere between probably 50,000, 100,000 acre area to fence in to support a proper, if you like, genetically varied wolf population.
The problem of not enough land in Europe is no problem, says Toby Aykroyd of the Wildlife Europe Initiative. He says there are quiet but very active negotiations now to buy out cattle and sheep farmers in Scotland and elsewhere, to re-establish large ecosystems and reintroduce species like the beaver and even wolf and lynx. The movement is called rewilding. That's actively being talked about in Scotland.
It is being looked at, as I've said, in tandem with an assessment of the economic benefits for the local economy and the local community. But again, there are so many other aspects.
What would be
of
the benefits,
rewilding
economic benefit?
Well, enormous, and in that on a regional economic basis, you would be attracting in a large number of visitors.
Ecotourism is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And the so-called wilding argument is driven by the fact that many farms are not profitable. Wild Europe notes the European Union spends more than $1 billion a week on farm subsidies and wants to turn some of those farms back to the beavers and wolves.
What we're saying is that in a lot of areas, that economic productivity, strictly speaking, no longer exists. So for everybody's sake, for the landholder's sake, the farmer's sake as much as everybody else's, let's look at alternative land uses. There will be a need to buy strategic areas of land because the establishment of ecosystems and their enrichment is a long-term process. And you need to have the basic structure in place so that you can assure that, if you like, in ecological terms.
The debate over rewilding is now being driven by successful reintroductions, whether it be wolves in Yellowstone or beavers on the Otter River. Notable environmental cascades that have not only changed ecosystems, but have altered the course of a global conversation about wildlife. I'm Dana Lewis, reporting for Insight.
Well, let's understand a little bit more about rewilding, shall we? I'm joined by David Hone. He's a lecturer in zoology, specialising in ecology at Queen Mary, University of London. David, does rewilding always work?
It's very hard to say because so few events have happened so far. Certainly lots of ecological introductions in the past have gone horribly wrong, but these are traditionally non-native species. In the case of things like wolves and beaver in the UK or large parts of Europe, these are species which have been present here for tens or hundreds of thousands of years, maybe even millions, and have only gone extinct in the last couple of hundred. So they are genuinely part of the environment. They just have been missing in basically recent human memory.
It's sort of a human guilty conscience, this. Is the implication that we feel as the human race we've interfered with the ecology of this particular area of the earth and therefore we should put it back in some way?
I think that's certainly an aspect of it. These are animals that were hunted to extinction often for no more reason than they were considered a pest or a threat, or simply we didn't want them around, rather than they were necessarily actually a real problem. And certainly people now, as society as a whole, we are much more aware of the damage that has been done to the environment and is continuing to be done to the environment. And this is certainly a step where we can begin to go back to something which is in many ways more natural, more normal.
Right, but the environment is the static thing, is it? It adapts and it changes. So our experiments in putting stuff back don't necessarily restore things to where they were 10, 20, 100 years ago.
Not necessarily, but there would be a strong hope that it would, and certainly the Yellowstone example which we've just seen is exactly a classic situation where we really do seem to be going back to the situation that was the case, 200-300 years ago, and has actually happened surprisingly rapidly. We can't necessarily predict what will be like 200 or 300 years from now, but all of the indications are good. And compared to some of the things that have gone wrong or some of the devastation that we have wrought relatively recently, I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say that it's a fairly safe bet in many ways.
Is the scale of that experiment, the sheer size of the landscape they can put this controlled experiment into, important, do you think? Is that significant?
Certainly scale can be important when you're looking at things like wolves. They require a very large area to hunt in because they themselves are large predators, require large numbers of prey, and therefore the area is commensurately large. But it doesn't necessarily need to be like that. I mean, small species on relatively small islands or relatively small enclosed areas can certainly be done at a much smaller scale. You don't necessarily need hundreds of thousands of square kilometres.
The beaver example and the increase in flooding, I mean, that's one factor. Our changing weather patterns, globally speaking, I mean, in North America, particularly I suppose here in Europe and so on, that also is a factor too, isn't it?
Well, we're certainly seeing more extreme weather events as a result of climate change, and global warming is one aspect of that, but then anything that might mitigate that, particularly if it's effectively free beyond the cost of introducing a few beaver is surely potentially an enormous economic benefit. And these things are true for the wolves as well. And we just heard in that story talking about the ecotourism argument. But actually, the UK spends a huge amount of money in culling deer, and deer are estimated to cause tens of millions of pounds worth of damage in Scotland. And this is simply because they have no natural predators. We've wiped them out. We have no bear, we have no wolves, we have no lynx.
So if you put those three back, if you could,
yeah,
would things even up a bit?
Again, it's hard to say absolutely, but it's hard not to think that it wouldn't. And again, North America is different, but Yellowstone is a classic deciduous or mixed woodland environment with lots of grass. It's temperate. It's very similar to Scotland and the north of England. I think there's a very good chance it would work. I'm
interested on the economic argument for this. Ecotourism, I understand it exists. I understand there are some people who, of course, need to be wealthy in their own right to be able to afford to go on an eco-tourist holiday. But that doesn't replace income that the agriculture industry is gaining from the land, does it?
That would
doesn't come close.
That you'd have to speak to the economists. But again, if we're spending, I think I looked up the economic damage for deer, red deer in the UK is estimated at over £10 million a year.
Really?
That's an enormous amount, and that's both in terms of damage that they're doing to the environment and in terms of damage that they're doing to agricultural crops. And then that's on top of the money that we spend actually culling them from very large areas.
Take us out of the Scottish areas where you're thinking about the deer to other arguments. It has been that agriculture has demanded more space. So particularly in the British countryside, we've seen the phenomenon of hedgerows going, fields turned into great prairies, nothing quite like on the American scale, but something approaching it, just to make sure that the mechanisation of agriculture is cost effective. There's a return on investment. Now, that strikes me then that this kind of return to nature doesn't stand an economic argument. It doesn't stand up against that kind of mechanised agriculture.
Well, it depends how you institute that policy. So, for example, two major effects that we know from just this kind of expansion to very large fields. First of all, monocultures, so one field of all of one plant, generally don't produce as much material per unit area or per unit investment as if you actually mix your crops up. So actually making bigger and bigger fields
of barley,
of one
field
thing.
of corn, that works better.
Yeah, alternating it on a single site or even multiple things together on a single site, but also in particular pollination. Many people will be aware of the kind of bee crisis, the fact that we're losing bees in large numbers. We're also losing lots of other pollinators. And if you make a single large monoculture, and then also if on top of that you're stripping out the hedgerows and the borders, the pollinators are not there to pollinate your crops. So you're actually making a bigger problem for yourself and potentially costing yourself far more in the lack of productivity of that land.
So we could see a reverse in this, could we? We could see hedgerows and dividers put back?
I would hope to see a reversal in this. Beyond the just natural saving of native species and environments for these things like dormice, all kinds of pollinators, insects, arthropods, etc. There is also a big economic argument potentially in terms of how these things operate and interact with the agricultural land and the crops that we're producing.
We'll continue our conversation in just a moment. You're watching Insight. Next, the immigrants are taking over when messing about with nature goes horribly wrong.